Okay. Hello everyone, and welcome to this VicTESOL event, online Q&A session, support and advice for EAL teachers in primary school settings. My name is David Keslis. I'm the Professional Learning Coordinator at VicTESOL. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we meet on today, their elders past, present and emerging. 2019 is the UN Year of Indigenous Languages, and we at VicTESOL would like to acknowledge the rich lessons that we can learn as educators from Indigenous peoples who have created and maintained links through language that have lasted for tens of thousands of years. Today we are very fortunate to welcome our three panellists. We have Michelle Andrews from Preston East Primary School, Rebecca Jones de Villagran from Blackburn English Language School, and we have Juliana Mikuli, Regional Project Officer from the Department of Education. Please note that this session will be recorded and made available for you after the session. Links will also be made available to you via the chat function and will be sent out to you via email in the days afterwards. I'll now hand over to Michelle to start the session. Thank you.
Hello everyone. We've received a lot of questions and they broadly fit into about 6 categories, so that's how we're going to treat them today. The first category is about EAL resources, another about assessment, moderation and reporting. Then we're going to group the questions about the EAL developmental continuum and programming. We'll move on to classroom curriculum, pedagogies and strategies. Then use of first language, and then finally EAL in the mainstream professional learning and new arrivals program and using interpreters. We're sort of grouping those ones together. So the structure of the session will be that we'll spend approximately 10 minutes talking, and we'll try and cover 2 of the broad topics, and then we'll allow 5 minutes where we can answer further questions that come up around those topics. So if you can use the question and answer tab to write your questions either as we talk, or we'll give you a little bit of time at the end of each of those 10-minute blocks, and we'll get to as many as we can. Some of the questions we received weren't very clear, so if you feel that your question hasn't been answered, please feel free to use that function to clarify it further. We'd welcome your feedback after the session, as this is a different kind of PL event for VicTESOL, and we're keen to know whether it's been useful and how to improve future sessions. We'll be moving fairly fast because there's a lot to cover, so we won't have time to cover things in great depth. So if you've got a question that's urgent, you can go to the VicTESOL Facebook page and discuss things there, or contact your RPOs, and those details will be provided at the end of the session along with all the other links. So I'll just hand over to Rebecca now. She's going to discuss our first questions.
Great, thanks Michelle. I'm going to start by addressing some of the questions we had around EAL resources and how they can effectively be used with EAL students. The first question was about phonics and how phonics should be taught in EAL, and what's the place of systematic synthetic phonics in EAL. In the new arrival program, we do teach phonics in this way, but in conjunction with a range of other strategies. It's important to note that EAL students need a lot of rich language, and they need to really enhance their vocabulary development in a meaningful context, alongside with the skills for decoding as well. So it's really essential to choose texts that are relevant for students to support their vocabulary development and their understanding as they move between the levels of sentences, words, whole text meaning. So even though we teach phonics explicitly, we try to embed it in what we're doing in the classroom, whether it be through a story or a poem, and we make sure that it uses repetitive and familiar vocabulary, so the students are just recycling that language that they're familiar with. Also to make sure that we use multiple exposures through reading, we link it to handwriting, and plenty of opportunities to practice the phonics through their oral language tasks, through rhymes and chants and things like that. So phonics instruction is more meaningful to EAL learners when they can link it to their prior knowledge, and especially through their oral language and vocabulary. So I hope that answers the question about phonics in a general way. But yeah, in summary, we do teach phonics through a range of different strategies, depending on the needs of our learners. The next question we had on resources was about audio-visual applications and how they can assist language appreciation, and how they can be run in a successful blended or differentiated way so it's more inclusive for students, and what combined programs we could recommend. So there's a lot to that question. We're a little bit unclear about the meaning of what sort of audio-visual applications you're referring to, or what you might be currently using in the class. So I think I'll just talk about, firstly, audio-visual applications in general and whether they're an inclusive practice. They are definitely a useful tool for EAL students, but as with any resource or text, you need to make sure that you've thought about, is it relevant for the students, and ask yourself some questions like, do students or do all students have access to the technology, especially if tasks are set for homework and they need to access these things at home or outside of school. Also think about how much previous learning or experience the students have with using these types of tools. If they don't have much experience, then how much explicit teaching will you need to do to get students familiar with the tool before they can start using it in a meaningful way? Is the application itself appropriate for EAL students? And that could be, culturally, at their language level. Is it language appropriate? And is the goal worth it? And is there another way that could better reach and achieve the purpose that you're trying to accomplish from using that application? So once you're sort of sure that these applications are the best way to get that across, then apps can definitely be a great way to practice and reinforce some of the skills that EAL learners use. I'll give you some examples of a couple of apps that we use in the New Arrivals program, and we like these apps because they can be differentiated. The teachers can set the task according to the students' different levels, and we can use them with a number of our different units of work that we teach as well. So the first one is called Explain Everything. It's an app that we use on iPads, and students can use the app to create videos or animated stories, visuals, and the great thing about it is that they can record their voice over the visuals that they created, and they can rehearse their oral language while practicing the language. So we find that one really useful. Another one we've just started to use is one called Seesaw, and this is another online tool where teachers can set tasks, and students log in and complete video recordings. They can read a text. The teacher can set tasks like retelling a story, and it's really useful for students to practice their oral language. So and also can be differentiated for different language levels. And yeah, we find that any app that helps students to recycle and consolidate the language that they know is really useful and engaging for their learning. We'll post all of these links in the chat. You can see if you want to explore those further a bit later on. The final question we had about resources, just briefly, were about the department resources being out of date on the website and where better resources can be accessed. So it would be good to know which resources you consider outdated so we can have an idea of which ones you're referring to. But I'll give you a list of a couple of great places that you can go and find some useful EAL tools. The first one is the EAL website. That's the Tools for Enhancing Assessment Literacy. And they've got a range of assessment tools, some rubrics pre-made, and also a professional learning section that you can go and access and have a look at some more EAL strategies there. Fuse also has a number of great EAL resources. A really good one that you should all try and get to is LeMerc, which is the Languages and Multicultural Education Resource Centre located in Carlton. You can have a look at, they've got a range of language resources there that can be checked out for a few weeks. And you can even let Jenny Peck at the library know if there are any resources that you would like to have purchased for the library, if there's something missing. And even regional and rural teachers are able to go onto the website or call the library and get access to those materials and have them sent out and borrowed for a couple of weeks where needed. So that's a great one to check out. In addition to those, the Vic TESOL website has great resources if you check out online. You can also Google resources from the UK and Canada. They often have really great materials for EAL. There's a website called Twinkle that we use a lot in our program. They have really great vocabulary flashcards, and they have, you know, posters, differentiated reading comprehensions, really suitable for EAL learners. And you can even create your own worksheets on that one. So they even have translations of some of the languages, which is really useful for beginning English learners. And finally, the literacy toolkit on the department website is currently being updated. So you can find more information when that becomes available online. We've put all of those links in the chat, so you can have a look at those further. And yeah, I'll have to move on to the next section. Thanks, Michelle.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to talk about assessment and moderation and reporting broadly. There were some questions asking about using the continuum to assess and demonstrate student learning, ensuring those assessments are accurate, and then what do we do when we're concerned about progress. Students obviously can differ as to how quickly they progress in different language modes. They might acquire oral language quite quickly compared to their development in reading and writing, or if they've learned English overseas, it might be the opposite. They might have written skills but take a long time to develop proficiency in spoken language. Students can move quickly on the continuum at first and then slow down as they move further up, although also some levels seem more dense than others, and it can take longer for the students to move through them. So while students may have made progress since the previous assessment, they don't always achieve a new level every time you assess them. They might have made progress, say, within B 2.2, but they're still not at B 3.3 standard. I think the important thing is to ensure that you keep detailed records of progress so that you can demonstrate progression within a stage as well as between the stages. I use a language profile, which is just the nutshell statements and the indicators in the document for each child, and I highlight indicators as the student can consistently demonstrate that indicator. And by using different colours each time I assess, I build a record of progression that demonstrates progress both within the level and gives me evidence for the judgment I've made when I move them to a new level. This is a shared document, so I give it to the classroom teachers to add what they observe as well. If there are concerns about progression, for example, a student who's not making similar progress to other students of a similar age and background, then perhaps it's time for further investigations. So at what point would an EAL student need to be referred to specialists for further assessments for learning difficulties? Certainly you wouldn't do this too early in their EAL journey. The decision to seek further assessments would be based on a lack of progress over time, so, as well as your observations of the student. Take into account the student's background, for example, is there trauma or refugee experience? Have they had any previous schooling, etc.? It can be a good idea to work with an interpreter or an MEA to get an indication of their language development in their first language as well. You might consider further assessment if the class teacher and the EAL teacher are both concerned and the student isn't progressing as expected on the EAL continuum. If they seem to have other difficulties other than the average EAL student, for example, conceptual rather than language-based difficulties. If they seem to struggle to retain information or learning, or if the behaviour of the child is of concern, maybe they're beginning to misbehave or beginning to withdraw, beginning to avoid work, or beginning to despair, that's when you would outline your concerns to the parent first and get their permission. They know their child better than anyone, so they can give important information about the development and learning of that child. The school nurse or speech therapist might be able to be involved. They often know the developmental milestones, and so they can ask the right questions about the early years. Some test results can be skewed because the student has limited English, so there may be limitations as to what you can use. However, often this kind of testing will give some useful information, and if there are additional things we could be doing to help these students reach their potential, we need to be following those avenues. Be aware that any assessment tool that hasn't been normed on EAL learners won't be accurate, but our mainstream EAL students usually still need to participate in them. However, though the scoring may not be valid, you can still get some good information from these tests. Look at the patterns across the tests. For example, you might look at the reading results and see that the EAL students score poorly in inferential comprehension. Other things such as tech literacy can impact on our students as well, so we need to take those things into account and maybe even remind mainstream teachers that skills can't necessarily be assumed. Some assessment tasks need to be modified for EAL students. This could mean using rubrics to clarify modified expectations and success criteria. It could be differentiating learning goals for students at different levels on the continuum, or providing different levels of scaffolding for students at different levels. Books by Pauline Gibbons or Beverly Darrow-Wianka have lots of planning ideas for scaffolding student learning. Bev's also worked with Vic TESOL to develop resources based on the teaching learning cycle, and these are available on the Vic TESOL website. The TEAL website has some great assessment tasks designed specifically for assessing against the continuum and will fit with the new curriculum too, as far as I know. So definitely worth a look there. These work well as a moderation for your own assessment, but remember, like any test, they're just a snapshot of a child's ability on a particular day. For moderation, the TEAL website regularly hold online moderation workshops of student samples. They also have recorded previous moderation sessions, and they can be viewed on the TEAL website. TEAL also has student writing work samples with criteria sheets and commentary, and the DET website under EAL Developmental Continuum P to 10 also has student writing work samples with annotations. Moderation sessions are also often promoted on the Vic TESOL website, so keep an eye on that. Now, we have some time for some live questions, so we're going to give you a minute where we're just going to disappear and let you think and write, and we'll see if we can get to some of those questions in the next few minutes. Okay, we've received some questions here. Rebecca, would you like to talk about those apps?
Yes, so I'm pretty sure Seesaw is free. You can make an online account for your class and use that one for no cost. The other ones you'll need to go onto the website and have a look. I don't know off the top of my head how much they cost.
There's a question here about the profile that I use to highlight. So I'll answer that one. I've just I use a profile, and I know, Rebecca, you use a similar thing at Blackburn, that just has the indicators and the nutshell statements. I'm in the process of working out what to do with the new curriculum, so probably not worth me necessarily sharing the old document with you, because we'll be moving on to the new one. But basically I've just cut and pasted all the indicators, and the new curriculum looks like you could do that, and the way it's set out, you could almost have it as a table and highlight. And the main thing is getting, if you've got more than one person using the document, making sure that people only highlight things if the child can do it consistently. And that's why I give my ones to the classroom teachers, because if they demonstrate, if I think they can do something, they may not actually demonstrate that in the classroom when they're working more independently, and vice versa. The classroom teacher might see them doing something quite consistently, say in group work, that I don't see them doing in a withdrawal program. So it gives you a shared document and some shared language to talk about the students, and also raises the profile of EAL with the classroom teachers, which is a nice side benefit. I'm happy to share what I do with the new curriculum when it's done, when it's sorted.
Some of those other questions will be answered in later sections. So the ones on differentiation we'll try and address later in the session.
I'm just looking at, I can't see the name of the person. It says, Michelle, where we can the assessments that is, so I think there's a word missing. So whoever that is, if you can type your question again, we can try and answer it. If parents request for their child to be taken off the EAL report, but they still need to be on it, I would be having a talk to the parents and explaining to them just what the document is. I think sometimes parents maybe think that it means their child's not smart, and yet a lot of these parents would understand that it does take a long time to learn a new language. And so, you know, explaining that it is simply to track their progress, and why we use it, and that as professionals we need to report on the appropriate standards. We wouldn't be using, for mainstream kids, you wouldn't use standards other than the Victorian curriculum standards. So, you know, for EAL students, we use the standards that are designed for them, and that's part of our professional responsibility. Obviously they come off at some stage, and so, you know, if it's getting towards that stage, that could be a discussion you have with parents, and if you're in mainstream, the classroom teacher, the parents and the EAL teacher might get together and talk about that. Is there any more? We might move on, shall we, to the
I think some of the other ones will be addressed as we go through.
Yeah, all right. So Juliana, would you like to keep going from here?
Yep. Okay. Hi everyone. Is this on? I'm not too sure whether I am. I can keep seeing Michelle there, but anyway, that's all right. I hope you can hear me. We've got quite a few questions, so it may take a bit of time and we may not get through everything, but I think we've got some arrangements in case we do. So in this section where we were looking at the EAL developmental continuum and programming, we got quite a few questions about the developmental continuum and school leadership's understanding and placement of students on the continuum, as well as some programming. So we'll do the best. I'm speaking in terms of policy for the department, and I know that we've got some Catholics and independents on at the same time. So you will have to go back to your sectors to actually get some, further clarification about some of the new arrivals programs and some other bits and pieces. But anyway, we'll do the best we can. So there seems to be a little bit of confusion about whether you actually report using the continuum or the Victorian curriculum English, and it is quite clearly deep policy that that you actually use the continuum where it's appropriate. So I'm actually reading out some of the words in the documents that are posted on our website. So it says that the English language learning progress of EAL students should be assessed against the stages of the EAL standards. And it also explains that if for teachers' assessment of an EAL student against the English achievement standard places the student well below their peers and the student still requires substantial support in learning English as an additional language, then teachers should continue to use the EAL standards. In addition, it states that once an EAL student has reached the at-standard level of their respective A, B or S stage in all three modes of speaking and listening, reading and viewing and writing, they can be transferred to the Victorian curriculum F to 10 English for assessment and reporting purposes. So this means that once an EAL student is placed on the continuum, they have to reach the final level of the respective EAL stage on which they've been placed. So that would be A 2.3 or B 3.3 or S 4.3 before a teacher can begin to contemplate whether a student should be moved on to the Victorian English one. So they might start at different places, but they all have to get to the end of the stage before you move them on to English. So it's not a matter of being 6 or 12 months below their English-speaking peers. It's a matter of being able to demonstrate that they've achieved the at-standard level of the relevant final EAL stage across all modes before they're moved on. Students should not be on one report. It should only be on one report. They shouldn't be on both. So they should have either clearly an EAL or an English report. Now, I mean, this is a situation as it is at the moment. We know we've got a new curriculum coming and further advice will be coming from the department towards the end of this year. But at the moment, this is how it stands. So for reporting in June and December, which happens for DEET schools, this is what we're doing. So it's really a bit pointless asking teachers to assess EAL students on both, the English and the Victorian, the EAL one as well, because the EAL stages actually lead into the English. So they're not really, they're not really comparable, I suppose. The English curriculum is designed for a first language learner, and the EAL continuum reflects a second language learning pathway. So whilst there's similarities, there's also significant differences between the two. So for example, there are indicators in the EAL continuum that talk about formulaic language, for example, and that's something that you might see in a foundation student or a year 5 or a year 8 student if they're at the beginning stages of learning English. But you won't see those kinds of indicators reflected in the Victorian English standards. So it's really not appropriate to be using both or trying to align. I had some people saying that they're trying to align the continuum with the AusVals, which has now been superseded and replaced by the Victorian curriculum, or with any other kind of first language assessment tool, because the first language assessment tools are matching cognitive ability with, what the students can do in the language. So whereas our EAL learners can be older and can be still at the beginning stages, or can be younger and a little bit more advanced. So it's a different kind of thing that we're looking at. It's a bit like comparing apples and oranges, I suppose. TEAL Reveal, which is an online reading assessment tool, is also available for now for schools to use from the Insight platform, and all those links will come up. And if you're not really sure, maybe run them through that. It's a reading test, but it will give you an EAL stage, and it will show you what level those kids will be at. So if you come back with something that says they're at a level 2 in the EAL B2, then it would be an indication that they're probably still in need of EAL support. Also, there were some questions about A and D levels. Now, students in foundation should be placed on the EAL continuum if it's appropriate, and not on the A to D levels of the Victorian curriculum. It's quite clear on the VCAA website that if you go to the diversity of learners section, it explains quite clearly that the A to D stages are for students with learning difficulties. So it's not really appropriate. EAL students don't have learning difficulties. They're learning English. It's not a learning difficulty, unless, we can get some students that have got both, and then that's a different situation. And also, if you've got, I suppose, issues with your school staff or leadership not understanding how all of these documents work, then I would suggest that you call in your EAL RPO and they can work with your SEAL that is allocated to your school. This is in department schools, if they need to go further and to perhaps have some discussions with leadership, or have some sort of presentation to your staff. Now, in respect to placing students, I think Michelle already said a few things about how she puts her students on the indicators, but it's not really a case of getting a specific number of indicators before you move students on or off the continuum. It's a bit more of a holistic sort of process, and you need to work with the statements above and below to sort of see where the students are best placed and which descriptors best fit them. So you look at those nutshell statements and also at the indicators and the standard achievement statements as well, and work with all of those. There are samples on the website of there's samples on the EAL Continuum website of students at different levels or at standard. Moderation is really important, and you need to do that with your staff, and perhaps using the samples on the continuum or on the TEAL website. There are also samples of students attempting different tasks on the website with criteria sheets, and that's always a good place to start, and then use your own tasks that you use in your own school and start to sort of look at where your students approximate. And I think once you start looking at the student samples, you can see very easily where your students might fit, and you say, yeah, they're fairly similar to that, and it gives you a starting point. And of course you adjust that as you get to know your student better. Questions about differences between the new curriculum and the existing materials we have, and why the B stages have got such a wide range from year 3 to 8. We can't answer that because we're not the writers. So we suggest that you put your question directly to Kelly Hines, who's the EAL curriculum manager, or provide feedback directly to the continuum if you think it doesn't work, or perhaps it's a really good idea, or you want to see other things added or whatever. They're very keen to hear what you have to say. There are some familiarisation webinars that were recorded. All of those happened in May. Now there's nothing else happening. They may repeat them, I don't know, but at this stage we haven't got anything planned. So go into the professional learning section and you will be able to watch those and listen to them and look at the PowerPoints, and hopefully if you haven't attended something and want to know more about the differences between the new curriculum and what we've got, you can see that. Programming also, obviously it's a bit of a complex question because we can't, or what might work effectively in one school may not work with another cohort of students in another. Basically, however, there's probably a few principles that we need to work with when we're working with our programming for EAL students. With department schools, we have Cases 21 report ST21034, which will give you a list of your EAL students or your LOC background students. And then once you've identified your cohort, you go in, you need to do assessments, you need to work out what language levels they're at in the continuum. Then you need to be able to start looking at, well, how do I prioritise these students? Which are the ones with most needs, which usually are your more recent arrivals? And what kind of resources do we have? And it's a balancing act between that and how we prioritise. You can look at the EAL handbook, which you can download for free from the department website. It has a lot of programming options and it has a lot of information, and it shows you how you can work through developing an effective sort of program. Obviously, we need to review our program. Some people may have an EAL program that's been running in the school for a while. I think it's really important that you evaluate it every year because your cohorts change, the needs change, and our programs always start from the needs of our students. Okay, so that's where you've got to really start looking at, you know, what's their English levels, what are their English language learning needs, and therefore how can I organise them to best meet those needs. And it could be some intensive, it could be some collaborative, it could be a range of a whole lot of things. Yeah, obviously we'll have a look and see if some more questions have come up, if we haven't sort of picked up on everything you wanted answered. But I think I'll pass over to Rebecca now.
Thanks, Juliana. I'll keep going, and then after this section we'll have some more live questions. I'm going to talk now a little bit about curriculum, pedagogy and strategies in EAL teaching. One of the first questions we had were about current innovative pedagogy in EAL. So I can talk about some of the things that we are doing in our school at the moment. Michelle spoke earlier about the teaching and learning cycle, which we did some professional learning on last year with Vic Teasol. That's from Beverly Derevuyanka. And we've started looking at how we can incorporate this genre style of learning into our school. So throughout the cycle, there's a deep learning of the content area together with the target language. And it uses the gradual release of responsibility, which is ideal for our EAL learners as they get to know the genre. So they build up their knowledge of the field, they take part in supported reading, and then they learn about the genre and complete a number of supported writing and shared writing activities before they can move on to independently using the genre. We find it's really effective in building students' capacity to access the types of texts that they'll be exposed to when they get to mainstream schooling. In conjunction with the teaching and learning cycle, we have also begun to implement a program on functional grammar called How Language Works, and that's from Lexis Education. And we've found that that's really useful to teach students the patterns of language and in incorporation with the types of language in certain genres of texts. So that's something that we've started to explore and we're finding really effective as well with the New Arrivals program. And I know a number of other language schools have also started to incorporate that. Other new areas of research that are impacting EAL teaching and can also be seen in the new EAL curriculum are plurilingualism, translanguaging, and there are some of those translanguaging resources on Fuse as well. And I believe a presentation by Julie Choi, who I saw in the attendees list earlier on. So there's a link there to the Fuse website to find that presentation. Some people would like to know about some practical strategies for supporting EAL learners. So I'll move on to a little bit about how you could support students, especially in a mainstream school. Firstly, to support EAL learners in different mainstream subjects, in curriculum areas like mathematics or science, we find that providing students with a learning support folder is really useful. You can give them subject-specific vocabulary that they can insert, diagrams, word lists, it could be grammar lists that they might need to access readily, and they can carry those around to their different subjects and use them as a reference point. So having access to those and giving them the strategies to really build those vocabulary and language resources is essential. Someone else wanted to know about strategies for developing listening and speaking, another big one for EAL learners. So back to a lot of the tasks that you might be familiar with, doing dictogloss, lots of jazz chants, rhymes. These are really effective for building oral language skills with EAL learners. Communicative activities like information gaps, and you can also have a look in some of Pauline Gibbons' books. There's a book called Teaching English Language Learners in Mainstream Classes, and they have some great resources in there that you can have a look at, and other resources from Le Merc, as we mentioned before, some of those speaking and listening tasks. The final one was, what practical strategies can we use to build the capacity of colleagues in EAL? So I would really recommend using your PLCs if you've started the professional learning communities, or staff professional learning days to build knowledge of these new innovations in EAL teaching. Observations, of course, team teaching and coaching are other great ways to share knowledge and support each other with the strategies being used in EAL. I'll move on to a question around how to support students from refugee backgrounds, in particular with trauma, and how we can support them, especially with their writing skills. So it's important to remember that on the register continuum, building spoken literacy before moving on to the written text is essential. So they really need to build up their oral language in a safe and supportive environment to develop their confidence and their comprehension in English before they can then continue with their reading and writing skills in English. It does take longer for refugee and traumatised students, so up to 9 to 10 years to learn a language, and a lot of explicit teaching, lots of scaffolding, and building those language resources. There's some support for refugee students on the website. We'll put that link up in the chat function as well. I already answered a question sort of about grammar. There was another one about how we teach grammar, if we teach grammar, and if so, how. And the answer to that question is yes, we do teach grammar, often not in the traditional sense that perhaps a lot of students are familiar with back in their own countries. But we teach grammar through a meaningful context, so whatever unit we're doing, through the genres that we are teaching. We don't teach grammar separately, but we integrate it with the learning that is taking place in the class. So with the teaching and learning cycle I mentioned earlier, we do a lot of backward planning. So we start with the target genre, and then we analyse the language that is required for students to produce this text, and then we undertake a number of activities to practice the target language. That might be, for example, in a recount, practicing the past tense, in a description, building up noun groups through the functional grammar technique of building nominal groups and looking at that descriptive language. So we do it through the genres and through all the learning and activities that we're doing in class. Moving on to another question we had about whether the things we teach in EAL are, or some things that they want to know, what are some things we teach in EAL that aren't repetitions of the K-6 literacy curriculum? I guess the biggest difference is that with EAL students, they don't come with the same level of oral literacy and communicative ability in English. So the focus of the new arrival program with EAL students is to achieve the language learning goals and not so much the content. We teach the language through some of the content, but the goal is the language. So when we're talking about literacy, that's sort of in the terms of a first language pathway, and there isn't usually, with first language there's a match between the language and the cognitive ability, but for EAL learners, their linguistic skills don't always match their cognitive capacities. So the focus really needs to be on developing their use of language through speaking, reading, writing, tasks, etc. So I guess that would be the biggest difference there between the EAL and the K-6 curriculum. Finally, I'll just touch on some questions on differentiation, and I noticed some in the live chat, so hopefully this answers some of your questions that you had. And one of them was, how do we differentiate programs for students, especially for groups of multi-age students who sit at various levels on the continuum? And I suppose to answer that, a really effective differentiated program will provide different levels of scaffolding. It's not necessarily providing different tasks. You might be all working towards the same goal, but scaffolding the students at their different levels to reach that goal. And if it's multi-age, then you'll be looking at the different expectations that that student will be required to meet in their mainstream level. So you might have to modify some texts if you can't find a good text at that age level. We often, in the New Arrivals program, adapt or modify some of the texts so that it's accessible for our students. And then that way we can adapt them for our different language groups as well. It's really important with any differentiation as well with EAL to set up effective classroom management practices, which, that means you can work with a group of students while the others are working on another task independently. But for EAL learners, they may need to be taught these skills explicitly as well, because some of the classroom expectations won't be the same as in their country, and they will need to be taught some of those behaviour management and learning skills and strategies so that they can undertake tasks without needing the teacher's help all of the time. Finally, just for your lesson and unit planning, when you've got a range of different levels, just become familiar with the different language goals and also the content demands, so that when you're planning a lesson or a unit, you can analyse not just the content that's required or the content demands, but thinking about the language that the students need. And you can include those in your lesson planning, and that will help you to know what language is required for the students to meet the demands of that task. Finally, we had a question just regarding young learners with no prior schooling and how to manage those students, and how to support them best in the classroom. It's a good idea to get some background knowledge on the student, so some of their cultural and linguistic background. They may have no understanding of the language and are unable to tune into the sound of English. So really just building their oral language first, and teaching explicitly what appropriate behaviour looks like again in the classroom. It'll be a new learning environment, and some of those skills will need to be practiced and modelled as well. So, even things like lining up and entering the classroom, or sharing and turn taking. So collaborative learning is quite new for a lot of our new arrival students. So that's something that we really need to heavily focus on with our learners. So again, you can find some resources on the website, so we'll put that up as well for you. I think we have some time for a couple of live questions. So we'll go to the Q&A. Oh, do we need a minute to...
there's a few questions here about what tools. I've just replied to one, like tools and tests that we use to assess students. And I guess, I don't know about the other two, but I've gathered over the years, you know, numerous bits and pieces that I've gathered together into my own little portfolio of favourite assessments. You know, obviously some of those are very simple for initial assessments, like letters and sounds and numbers and colours and you know, little pictures that the kids can talk about when you're assessing their oral language. There's the TEAL website. Some of the tasks on there are great because they almost are a little integrated unit, I guess, where the students are scaffolded up, and then you can assess their writing and you can assess their speaking and listening as well. The reveal's more a test that you would give them perhaps at the beginning of the year and the end of the year, or you know, not very often. It's more of a tool to give a level. However, things like running records, we use Fontes and Pinnell, but you can use the PM benchmarks. The scoring doesn't always work properly for EAL students, but you can get a lot of useful information about their reading. So I suppose using some of the tools that you have in your school, but being aware of what you need to modify and what you need to, what bits won't work for EAL students is probably the easiest way to start. Ladies, any other ideas?
Yeah, I was just going to say, someone's asking for some samples of modified assessment tasks and scaffolded lesson plans. And I was going to say, on the TEAL website, there is a lot of there's a lot of resources there, and there are units of work that actually show you how you can you know, work with EAL students in a mainstream class and adapt lessons and you know, activities for your EAL cohort. And also lessons, you know, samples of student work. So I'd recommend you do that. There's a 3-day program putting TEAL into practice, which we ran at the beginning of the year. I don't think there's anything planned for the second half of this year, but it may run again in the following year, which will give you time to learn about the TEAL website if you haven't attended.
There's also a question about the A levels. You know, are they broad enough to assess students? And what about students that are doing really well and you take them off the A levels because they've reached the end, but then they struggle in upper primary? I think that's the new curriculum, I think, is trying to address that in some ways. You know, the B levels have been extended from finishing at grade 6 to year 8, so that there's a little bit of an overlap there. There was talk that the A and B levels would be similar. So, for example, you could get a student who was in grade 2 had really achieved the A2.2 across the board, but you look then at the B levels and you say, well, you know, in 6 months' time, those are going to be the language expectations on this child. And so therefore, I'm not going to take them off the standards, and it might give you some flexibility. That's something that needs clarifying about how much flexibility is available between the A and B levels, but that might be something that you could feed back to the new curriculum, or send a response or feedback on that.
We move on. Michelle?
Okay. The next section is talking about questions about the use of first language in the classroom, in the playground, and also how to help parents who may not necessarily have a lot of English themselves support the students at home. So we recognise that students, oh, hang on, sorry. My lights go out here. I'm going to change. I'm going to go over near the window. We recognise that students can and should be encouraged to draw on their first language knowledge and resources, but it can be difficult to know how and when to do this, and when it's better to use only English. So I guess the overall answer is to use your judgment and consider the tasks and the resources you have available and use your knowledge of your students. Students in Australian schools are immersed in English for the whole day. So valuing, allowing and encouraging the use of their first language in the EAL classroom may be the only time in the day that they get to use their first language resources. If you have the ability to converse with the student in their first language, I would say that's great, and you should take advantage of that to support their English language learning, especially in the early stages of their language development. The use of MEAs can be a fantastic resource in the classroom if you, like me, are really only fluent in English. Letting the students use their first language when you don't understand what they're saying can be a bit confronting, but this anxiety can be managed if you set clear expectations, and obviously the tasks that they're doing will be completed in English. It would be more the negotiating part of it that they might use their first language for. As far as bilingual resources are concerned, LeMerc has bilingual dictionaries available. I'm not familiar with a lot of online translation resources, but I always fall back on Google Translate if I really need something. The students probably know these resources better than us, particularly the older ones. Juliana or Rebecca might want to throw something in later on if they're familiar with any. One question asked how to manage the use of different languages in the playground. It can be exhausting for students to listen and speak and read and write in English all day. So if they have friends who speak the same first language, allowing them to have a break and use their first language at playtime, it can help them to be ready for more learning in English when they come back inside. Managing what language students use at recess can be a bit of a losing battle. So I'd think carefully about what the purpose is. If there are issues of exclusion, for example, that should be dealt with as a social issue rather than as a language issue. Students often come to Australia with cultural expectations around learning that are different from those in schools here. And there's a question about Chinese students who are not used to asking questions. So in general, the cultural expectations need to be explicitly stated and explained that this is what we expect in Australia, this is how school works in Australia. And there might also be a need to do some explicit teaching about how to meet those expectations. For example, with those Chinese students practicing the question structures or politeness formulas. Creating a safe and inclusive classroom culture is the first step, obviously, so students feel comfortable to take risks and do things that they are not used to doing. We received questions about appropriate homework, supporting parents to assist their children with more appropriate homework tasks than the pages of grammar or writing out their home reading books. For new arrivals, I always suggest that they do very little homework at first because spending the whole day at school immersed in English is exhausting. Later, some things I often suggest for younger students that they read to their child in the first language. They listen to them read in English, talk to them about what they've read in either language. I often suggest they watch children's TV. For example, join in Songs on Play School. It gives them a good opportunity to practice their oral language and just get them to talk for everyday tasks. Encourage them to write and draw at home for fun. If they've got friends who speak English, invite them around to play. For older students, the same thing. Talk to them in their first language about what they're learning at school so that they can make the connections between the two languages. Discuss what they're reading, either reading in their first language or in English, but making those connections. Encourage them to reread their homework and check for mistakes or edit the punctuation or spelling. For more information, Melbourne University Language and Linguistics web pages have useful information relating to research in language teaching as well as resources. And the Research Unit for Multiculturalism and Cross-Cultural Communication is hosted by Melbourne University and has research information and resources relating to bilingual education. It builds on the work of Professor Michael Klein, who was very influential in bilingual research and learning in Australia. And this is probably being the most different part of the new curriculum, is something that, you know, we're all probably still learning about, and it'll be interesting to see how people put this into practice in their classrooms. Juliana, would you like to move on to the next category?
Okay, we had several questions about the new arrivals program and the use of interpreters and some PL for teachers. Now, given that we're running a little bit short on time, we will need to go over a little bit, so just be aware that we won't be finishing in, well, we probably should have finished a minute ago, so we'll take a few more minutes, but I will probably cut this a little bit short just to save a bit of time. Basically, it is deep policy that our new arrival students attend a new arrival program if they're eligible, and it is available to students from the department schools. We've given you some links so that you can actually go in and have a look at the eligibility criteria and have a look at where they are and get a bit more information. There's a virtual new arrivals program for students that are out in regional and rural areas. Now, regarding the Catholic sector and the independents, I know the Catholics have got some education officers, and I think we've got some people linked in today. I think Margaret Vingerhurst, one of the leaders there in the Catholic Ed office, might be listening in. So if anyone has some information, maybe they can put some information up in the Q&A that you can share with others. But yeah, there are some offices, and I think there's some money for refugee students, which is allocated directly to schools. But basically, with the independents, I'm not really sure. You have to find out. You have to go to both of those sectors if you work in those sectors and see what support is available. There was also a question about moving students in transitioning from a new arrivals program into mainstream. And obviously you can make that a better process if you link in with your English language schools and centres and have discussions with their transition officers. They do have people that transition the students into mainstream schools, so it'd be good to have a discussion with them and see what you can do and how you can collaborate together. Reports are provided to schools, but it is important that mainstream schools have a process for the dissemination of that information and it doesn't get lost. A lot of our English language schools and centres are very open to having visitors, and I think it's a really good idea if you can go in and learn a bit more about the program so that you can ease that transition for the students. And also, as I said, sharing information together and looking at orientation days and working collaboratively together to improve those processes. What else did we have? Oh, the interpreters. We have interpreters available for schools. It's the Victorian Interpreting and Translating Services, VITS. Now, all of our department schools have a code. Once again, there's a lot of information and guidelines available on the websites, which you can have a look at in the links. You can get materials translated for you, but there are limits to how much. But you can get extra translations, which just means that the school will have to pay for them. Interpreters can be used face-to-face for parent-teacher interviews and all that kind of stuff, but also telephone interpreting is available. So yes, please make use of that, which is often good for little emergencies. We also have resources on Fuse in terms of how to use interpreters, and it's a good idea to have a look at that and to actually do a bit of training with your staff, because there is a bit of a knack to being able to work with your interpreters. There's a range of multilingual notices which you can download that have been translated into a range of languages that you can just download and put in your information and use them with parents if you'd like to do that. So they're all available. And very quickly, just to finish off, in terms of professional learning programs, the ESL in the mainstream, teaching ESL students in mainstream classrooms, which we ran quite a few programs of in the past, and I think that the Catholic sector still runs some of those, is still available, but it's available through Lexis Ed, and they do more of the train-the-trainer model. So you need to go to their website, you can contact them directly, and you can find out what's involved. Once you have people trained, they can come back and, you can run more training programs in your own school. There are consultants available to run the programs, but I'm not sure exactly, who might be available and all that kind of stuff. So it might be good to talk to Lexis Ed. And of course, we have a PL available on the department website. And if you go in and use this search button and look up EAL Professional Learning, and Vic TESOL obviously run sessions, and there may be regional things available as well. So once again, make contact with your EAL RPO. I think we might just leave it for a minute in case anyone has a last final question, but then we're probably going to have to wrap it up in a couple of minutes. Yep.
Yeah, I think we're not going to get time to really specifically answer all the questions, but we might have time for just one or two. Is that all right, David?
That sounds good.
So there was another question here on what tools we recommend for initial assessments. Michelle did talk a little bit about what she uses, and in the new arrivals program we also have just a collection of our own initial assessment tasks that we've collated, but the general speaking and listening ones, it's an initial interview to find out about the student, and a picture for them to describe, which can tell us a lot about their vocabulary and sentence structures and that sort of thing. For reading, we do the phonics, sight words list, and the reading record. And we usually just get an uncoached writing sample at the beginning of the term as well, typically a recount or a family description, if the student's able to produce those independently. If they're really low, again, we can just get some samples of copying from the board that can even tell us if they're able to form letters correctly, tracing and those sorts of tasks as well. And we do make use of our multicultural education aids with the student's first language as well, to test in their first language if we're not sure if they're able to produce in their first language.
Yeah, there's also a diagnostic interview as part of the new draft curriculum. So it'd be worth you going and having a look at that, because if you feel that maybe there's other things that could be added, provide that feedback to the writers, because that's, really useful. Sorry, someone asked about whether the recordings are going to be available. David, is that?
That's right. Yes, we'll make them available later. You'll get a link in an email, and we'll also put that on our website.
There was one about dealing with multi-age of new arrivals and being a specialist EAL teacher with limited time and resources. I organise my groups, my withdrawal groups in broad areas, 1, 2s, 3, 4s, 5, 6s, or special little groups that are similar levels, and that changes every term because I only have time to take the highest needs students, or we've got kids coming out of language school, then they obviously come in and some other kids have to go out, and so then it's up to the mainstream teachers to take over supporting those students, although I do provide support for them. So I guess that the groups are constantly changing, and that's one of the challenges. And you do often end up with a group that's a bit broader than you would hope. It's again about differentiating. Even in a group of 3, you can have to differentiate between what your expectations are for each student, or for how much scaffolding you're going to give them. And it doesn't matter whether there's 20 or 3 or 4. Sometimes you just have to do that, and it's time consuming, but there's no way around it.
And there's another question there about, is there a syllabus to follow? There's no easy answer for that, and what to start with: sounds first, basic dialogues, alphabets, etc. Sometimes it's just a needs-based curriculum. You need to determine what the student already knows and work from that. And when you've got a class with different levels, different groups, again, it's just a matter of getting to know your students and what their language needs are. and then scaffolding your teaching according to those needs within the classroom. There's no quick fix, I'm afraid. It's yeah.
It can help you stay sane, organise it around a topic, so that you've got the students, you know, it's some of the things that there's some of the resources you're using are consistent, and you're just differentiating the tasks and differentiating the expectations. But the students are all doing, you know, zoo animals or whatever it is. But you can hang the different levels of language on that. And, you know, while some kids would just be saying the single words, or this is you'd have other students who'd be writing descriptions maybe, you know, and that might be how you have to do it.
Okay. Maybe we should wrap it up now.
Sure.
Yeah, I think we've covered most of the questions.
Mm-hmm.
So it's my very lucky job to say thank you very much, Rebecca, Juliana and Michelle, for all of your work, your preparation and sharing your expertise like this. It took hours of preparation for you guys to do this, so we really, really appreciate this at Vic TESOL. All links and the recording will be sent out in an email, so if you missed something on the chat function, you will be getting it in an email, and the recording will be sent out too. In the chat function, I've put a link to the survey. We really value your feedback as participants. If you could fill out this survey, it takes 2 to 5 minutes or so. We'd really appreciate your feedback. If you want to continue the conversation, you can join our Facebook page, which is also in the chat function, a link to there. This is a place where you can network with other teachers and also ask more questions, I suppose. We also have our symposium coming up on August the 19th, Monday the August the 19th. If you want to do more PD in the area of EAL, this is a great day. Again, the link to all the details about our symposium is in the chat function as well. I now encourage you to use the chat function yourselves. If you'd like to express your thanks to Rebecca, Juliana and Michelle, or leave a comment, please do that now. Thank you for attending to this Vic TESOL professional learning session.
Thanks, David.